It's not that my workshop is exactly the same as the ending scene in Indiana Jones, but when you're tidying up you do come across the odd dusty box of things where you think, what on earth is in here? Well, it turns out it's a load of arrows. In fact, a load of arrows that I made as part of my apprenticeship. These are all pieces that I had to make based on arrows from around the world and different cultures. I know you've probably seen in some of my other videos we've been looking at one or two of them. Which one should we take a look at today? We've done that one, the American Indian. Tell you what, let's have a look at the Viking arrow.
Did somebody say Viking? I am a Viking. Look, there is my Viking ship. Look at it.
These Viking-style arrows are based on the Nydam finds. There was no internet back in the days when I made these as part of my apprenticeship. They've got a very highly decorated nock, a sort of pinch grip nock. The end of the shaft there, as you can see, tapers, and then the nock is left sort of bulbous and has a slight groove in it for the string. And down at the business end of the arrow we have a tanged hand-forged head. Now a tanged head just simply means it goes into the shaft rather than over the shaft, and that shaft, much like the nock end, is actually slightly tapered down to meet that head and is then bound on with a copper wire. Here's another example of the head here, so you can actually see the tang. The tang is that extra piece of metal, that sort of spear-shaped piece, which actually goes into the shaft. Now, let's take a look at what we need to make one of these arrows. The first thing you'll need is an arrow shaft. I've had this nice pine one sat round for a while, so it's got a nice rich colour to match in with the other arrows. You'll need some feathers. These are natural feathers that I've found and sourced locally. I've cut the quill and ground them ready to put on rather than shop bought. And you're obviously going to need an arrowhead of your choice, and we're obviously using a tanged head here, and some copper wire I've nicked from BT. Oh, and some linen thread.
I am a Viking. He is making it all up. This is a cultural appropriation. He has me dressed like I am a man advertising costume for Halloween. Don't believe him.
Okay, let's measure our nock. We're going to need to carve this ourselves, so put a line on there, because I'm going to need to taper down to where that starts, and we're going to need to put in the groove. Now, groove orientation of nocks is the same as any other arrow. If you don't know what I mean, let's get it so that our groove is vertical. If you look down the arrow there, hopefully this works on the camera. Oh, yep, there we are. We can see those spear shapes of the grain rather than lines of the grain. So we have our groove upright, and we can see the spear shape, those loops of grain. Now that we've got that orientated, I've put a line on there so I know where I'm cutting. I'm going to use a really fine file here, a round file, which will give me the sort of shape I need for the groove. As you can see, I'm starting sort of either side of the pine shaft there. The one failing with pine, if you use something too abrasive like a rasp or something similar, you may find that it picks up and you get chunks of wood coming off. So use something like a file, like I'm using here, which is actually the sort that you'd use if you were going to sharpen the blades on your chainsaw. Some of you probably recognised it, and it's about the right diameter that I need to get a nice groove into there. As you can see, once you get it started, it's fairly easy. Just take your time and make it deep enough so that it will fit onto the string. Let's fast forward this a little bit. There we are. So that's about as far as you need to go. I'll obviously be tidying that up, but that's deep enough as far as the groove goes. To make the nock bulbous, we need to reduce that last probably 2 inches before where the nock is. Now, to give me a guide, a physical guide, I'm actually going to score where that line is that we made earlier on. That'll make it a lot easier for me to reduce the end of that shaft towards the nock. That physical line that I've made with the knife is really going to aid me now that I'm using a file. I'm tipping the file at quite a high angle, so I'm getting the very edge of the file side of this rasp into that groove, and I'm just taking the wood back away from our nock so that we're leaving the nock bulbous, and we're going to create a probably 2.5 inch sloping taper from the mid of the shaft towards where the nock is. As you can see, I've made a good start there. It enables me to flatten out that file now and actually start taking a bit more wood off. Let's speed up this video footage and see how I do.
His hands are quicker than the lightning gods. And my wife.
Yeah, it would be nice if your hands were that quick. You'd get things done in half the time. Now we've nearly finished that taper. I've been removing the wood, as you can see, and well, that's pretty much as far as I'm going to go with that one. There we are, back to real time, and that's how it looks. That's the basic shape of the nock done. And I've just used a little bit of sandpaper and rounded off the edges, and now we're going to look at actually doing the decoration. As you can see, I'm using a blade here. It's normally the sort of blade that I'd be putting an arrow plate into the side of a bow with. I am pushing quite hard, as you may or may not be able to see. Please be careful if you do this, because obviously you could risk snapping the end of this nock off, particularly where we've reduced the diameter there. Now I'm just putting on a line going all the way around. I'm actually going to repeat that process so we end up with 2 lines going all the way round. I'm making the impression with the knife fairly deep so that at least it actually shows up as a decoration. Now that I've gone all the way round, I'm going to go in between. I'm using the tip of the blade here. The camera shot here is quite deceiving. It's actually a very, very small piece of wood that I'm working on here. It's not quite as easy as it looks. Okay, I've gone all the way around on there. So I'm actually going to repeat the process at the top. Now here you need to be even more careful than you were at the bottom. As you can see, a little bit's lifting there because obviously we've really not got much wood at the top there where we've put the groove in. So I've got the one line going around. I'm going to repeat that process, put in a second line, and I'm going to then start doing the opposite lines with the tip of the blade there. Now that I've done those top and bottom, I'm actually going to do one through the center of that design. I'm actually wrapping it around, so a line going from top to bottom, but rather than just completely horizontal, I'm actually curving it around the shape of the nock. I'm going to do the same pattern, so once I've done one line, I'm going to do another line right next to it. There we go. And I'm also going to repeat that on the other side, so we've got 2 separate lines going around. Once those are done, the same process begins again. I'm going to use the tip of the knife and I'm going to make that same crosshatch pattern going in between those lines. As you can see, some bits of wood do come away. Say the pine does sort of, it doesn't lend itself to chipping away at it that easily. And there we are, that's how it looks once we're done. If you want to make that pattern that you spent all that time working on stand out a little bit more, then grab a bit of charcoal out of your fire. Make sure the fire's cold first before you do this, obviously, and rub it in. If you rub it in carefully enough, you should be able to get it in deep into all those lines using the method that I'm showing you there. Once you've done that, grab a bit of sandpaper and get rid of the black that you've put on the outside. Hopefully, if you've done it well enough, it should leave the black lines on the inside. Now it's time to put the feathers on. At last, we're getting somewhere. Now, these are the natural feathers that I was talking about earlier on, but obviously, they're a little bit long, so we're going to need to cut them to shape. I've made sure they're all from the same wing, so they all fly the same way. I'm going to use my handy bit of wood here, which has got some measurements already laid out on it to help me out. We're going to cut it to around 4.5 inches long.
Why don't you sharpen your tools, you fool?
Sorry, I probably should use a sharp blade. That would probably help a bit, really, wouldn't it? So they're ready to glue onto the shaft. We've used our big jig here, which can cope with the larger feathers. So all 3 are on, and now we're ready for cutting them to shape. We're actually going to cut the physical height of the feather down. Now, if you've got a decent pair of scissors and a keen hand, you can probably do it without tape, but putting on the masking tape really does help. It keeps all the feathers together as you're cutting, and with this inch-wide tape, of course, it gives you the ideal measurement, because I can cut just straight down the middle of the feathers, and I know that I'm getting a 1/2 inch high fletch. Once those are cut, you can just simply take the tape off. It doesn't leave any residue, so don't worry about that. And I say this is probably the easiest way to cut a feather once it's actually onto the arrow. And of course, the feather being on the arrow, it keeps it nice and straight while you're cutting. So there we are, taking all the tape off, and that's what we're left with. Now we're ready for binding. To help keep the feathers bound on and make things a little neater, a little top tip here, remove a little bit of feather top and bottom, but leaving the quill on, and then pare the quill down a little bit so it's just near the height of the shaft. Now we can start binding on with the linen thread. Now you've probably seen me do this in other videos, but I'm going to show you again. I bend over a little bit of that linen binding thread, place it against one of the quills and hold it on with my finger. Then pulling quite tightly, I'm able to bind round the bottom there and hopefully catch onto that little piece that I hooked up. There we are, and I can keep that tight again with my finger, and then we can just start binding all the way up in the normal way.
He is talking nonsense. We used to tie on the feathers with the hair of our enemies and glue on the feathers with the tears of their women.
Once we've finished doing that main section at the bottom, it's time to start binding on the actual feathers in the normal spirally bound way that we do. This is very similar to the medieval style that you're probably familiar with, and you've seen me do a few times, and you've probably done yourself. Now we've reached the top. Now this is where things get a little bit differently. Normally we would put binding just at that top section there where we've pared down the quill. But these type of arrows, these Viking style arrows, the binding goes all the way up to the top to meet that bulbous nock. So we're actually binding along a slope. This can be quite difficult. You need to make sure occasionally that you re-bunch up that binding because it can sort of get a little bit loose. Now we're doing the tying off. Now normally when you're tying off you've got a bit more area to work with. Here it's a bit fiddly. I'm having to put the extra bits onto the nock, so I'm using the nock as my tying off area. So I'm binding the opposite way to that's going to be required, and I'm going through the loop as you can see there. Hopefully that makes sense just by what you're seeing. It's always difficult to try and explain this tying off bit. I know it's something that people comment about that they have trouble with, but it's all practice like all these things. The other thing that takes a bit of practice, and I actually do get it wrong here, is guessing how many loops you need to be able to get it correctly nice and neat so that it goes from where we finished off binding to actually it butting up against the bottom of the bulbous part of the nock. And as you can see here, I'm about one away from it being tight, one away from it being neat. So I'm actually going to fold that loop over and put another layer of binding on. There we are, as you can see, and that's now pretty neat. All we need to do is pull that through, so pull that nice and tight, and hopefully it's still butted up against the bottom of the nock. There we go. Yeah, it gets a little bit tied up, and there we are. So then that's nice and neat. All that's left to do now is obviously cut off the excess. But there we go. That's how it looks. Let's take a look now at getting the head on. Now, it's not really on, is it? It's more sort of in, because it's a tanged head. So we need to get that little spear of metal actually down into the shaft. You could probably do this in all sorts of different ways. I expect there's clever people out there who can make some sort of jig to hold it. But I'm doing it old school. Bit of leather to protect it. Stick it in the vise. And yeah, that holds it steady enough. I'm just going to use a drill. I'm hand holding a drill. I've made a little mark into the centre of the shaft so I know where the centre is. I'm actually using a Dremel here, so it's nice and light and easy to hold, and obviously just carefully drill down into the shaft. And I've made sure that that drill bit is approximately the same size as the tang. Hopefully I've drilled in straight enough, and hopefully it is the right size. Let's just check. And yeah, that's perfect fit. Excellent. And now all we really need to do is check that it's on straight. So holding the arrow up to the eye, looking down the shaft and checking that it's straight. If not, you can do a little bit of tweaking. The only thing left really is the end of the shaft there. As you can see, we've got a bit of a lip, so we need to pare down the end of the shaft similarly as we did to the top, so it meets with the actual head itself. So I'm just going to use a file here, really. Be careful not to file the actual arrowhead. So yeah, we're just removing the wood all the way around till hopefully that matches up and fits with the head. And yeah, that's probably about as good as it needs to be. So now we can start thinking about putting on the copper wire. So let's unwind some of that and get it put into the end. Because we're going to be gluing that head in, and we're actually going to be binding from the arrowhead back up the shaft, we need to get a little end of that copper wire into the hole before we stick the head in. I'm just going to use some hot melt here, some clear hot melt glue, so it won't show up quite so much. Once you've put it onto the tang, you may need to heat it up again before you actually put it into the shaft. There we go, and let's seat it in, and obviously double check that you've got it correctly aligned so that it actually isn't too wonky. To keep things nice and neat, you're going to want to get rid of some of that excess of the glue, because in that gap, that's where we're actually going to be starting our binding. So we've got the wire there, and we've got our gap nice and ready in between the shaft and the head. So let's start by putting it a few turns into that gap. Now, working with the wire is essentially the same as using any linen or silk thread, but as I'm sure you can imagine, the wire fights with you a little bit more. It's much tougher, much more springy, and doesn't quite like to go into the places that you're trying to put it quite as easily as the thread. And obviously with the same with any binding, you're having to pull quite tight to keep everything tight onto the shaft and to stop it springing off. But because of the very nature of wire, if you move it too much, where it's in my right hand there, it can break. So there's a fine balance between getting it nice and tight and neat onto the shaft and actually breaking the wire, which if you break the wire, you kind of have to remove the head, put some wire back into the shaft and start again. The reason for the wire obviously is to stop the shaft breaking because of the tang. That's the reason we're putting this on. So there we are, we've gone quite far up the shaft now. That's probably far enough as we need to go. You could put more on if you like, but that's as far as I normally like to go. Now we need to start the tying off process, which again is the same process as before, but like I mentioned, the wire is that much more awkward to work with, and again you're putting a lot of pressure, as you can see on my left hand there, to stop all that binding that I've already put on from coming undone. And I'm also holding up the loop with that left hand as well, and then with my other finger I'm pushing through the loops with my right hand, my free right hand, I'm pulling through those loops and looping it round onto the shaft. So once I've gone round enough, we can then start binding that on. Hopefully in this close-up you can see there, so I'm pulling the end across the binding that I've already done and then using the tying off loops to go over that end there, so hopefully that will keep it all together. And like I said before, this is slightly more awkward because of the wire, so you do need to concentrate quite hard on this because it can all just come unsprung and just kind of ruin your day, to say the least. So I'm holding it on there quite tight and pushing up the bindings there so that I'm getting rid of any gaps that are appearing as I'm going. So we're nearly there, and obviously the last process is to pull that wire through, which again you've got to do carefully, otherwise it can snap, which hopefully, no, it didn't, so yeah, we got away with that one. There we are, so I just need to cut that off with some pliers. And there you have it, folks. That's the finished arrow. So that's all our copper wire on, all nice and neat. Nice close-up there of it. Quite pleased how that's come out, really. And that's the finished arrows there. They are. That's the old one at the top, the one that I made back in the 90s, and the new one at the bottom. It's interesting to see how the colours have changed over the years. It's all basically the same materials. And that's the fletched end as well there. Well, if you'd like to have a go at making your own, then obviously we've got all the bits and pieces. We've got various different tanged heads, which will be in stock on the shop. I'll put that link below.
Thank you for watching the video. If you don't hit subscribe, I will come and pillage your village. Press the button. Press it now. Press it.